Welcome. Welcome to Science Unwrapped. My first time here. I'm really excited about being here. I've got a question right off though. By show of hands, how many people like good bread? All right. I'm in good company then. So I'm going to have our assistants pass out this bread. This bread is from Crumb Brothers Bakery. They've donated it. And I want you, when you take a piece, hold off on eating it. And because I want to talk about some of the nomenclature of bread, how we talk about bread. So when you go out there, you'll be educated. So I want you to look at the outside of it. The outside is called the crust. And the crust should be, of a well-made bread, should be golden, maybe even a little bit dark. And that's for flavor. And then look at the inside, and the inside is called the crumb. And that should have kind of a nice, as they say in the baking world, open cell structure. So little open air pockets where the yeast were. And what that does is it tells you that whether the bread was made really well, that it had some nice rise and important characteristic, and then just put it up to your nose before you eat it and see what kind of aromas you get. And then go ahead and eat it and savor it, and then we'll come back to that maybe in the question and answer period and talk about any details about that. So I'll bet many of you have had some sort of life-changing or maybe career-altering experience with a person, or maybe an ideal, or a trip that you've gone on that has kind of changed, maybe not changed your life, but changed the trajectory of how you thought about things, kind of given you that broad look at the horizon type of experience. And that certainly happened to me, and that happened when I was probably in about my 8th year of having the Grapevine restaurant. And I read this 1995 Smithsonian Magazine story about this gentleman, Lionel Poulin. He's a French baker, second generation baker. Originally, his father started the bakery in Normandy, and he decided to bring his baking style to Paris. And that style was a very simple, what they call now artisan style of baking, and it involved the grain stone milled. It involved kind of simple mixing processes, sometimes even with the hand, and it also involves baking in a wood-fired oven. And so it wasn't just his story, but that captivated me, but it was really his commitment to using generation techniques that have been passed down through the generations, and then mixing it with kind of a modern outlook on incorporating baking into the modern times. This bakery was passed down to his daughter, and she's continually doing the same thing. So when I had my restaurant, I thought I had a really great bread program, and I was really happy with it. It was recipes from a kind of a book that was written by a Franciscan monk. So they're really interesting recipes. They had a lot of different additives to it, different grains and mixes. But it was pretty much white flour and commercial yeast. And now, there's nothing wrong with that kind of bread at all. I loved it then, and I still love that kind of bread. Diane and I, my wife, just watched the great baking cooking show the other night, and they had this wonderful bread that was a commercial yeast-driven bread with white flour, I think, and it was called Tear and Share. And they loaded it with, the contestants loaded it with all sorts of flavor ingredients, and it just looked wonderful. But what I'm doing tonight is I'm talking about, let's see where I am. So I'm talking about baking in the United States with whole grains, and it's baking with breads, pastries, and pasta. And I'm going to just stick with bread tonight because it'll get too complex, but this is happening, baking with whole grains with all sorts of bakery items. This whole grain, I'm calling it a revolution because it just really started about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, but this whole grain revolution has been primarily driven by young bakers. This gentleman is from Germany. His name's Pablo Giet, and he has kind of the equivalent of a master's degree in baking science, and he is amazing in the detailed science aspect as well as the production of really great whole grain breads. These young bakers are asking new questions. They're asking, where are their ingredients coming from? Are these grains being grown organically or biodynamically? What's going on with these grains' origins? They're asking questions about nutrition. They want high nutrition in their breads. And of course, flavor. They want to extract as much flavor out of that as they can. This gentleman, his name of all things is Josie Baker. He's a baker in San Francisco, and he has this wonderful bakery, and he's been able to market his bakery in a real interesting way that attracts a lot of young people, a lot of millennials, and he has this really interesting little room in the corner of his bakery, and this room has a stone milling device where he can take his grains right there, mill his flour, and mix his bread. And he's pretty amazing. I saw this this chalkboard in a bakery, and it kind of made me think about the kind of the mantra that these young bakers are having, and it's 100% stone milled. I'll use this. It's using a wild culture, and we'll talk about the wild culture. It's wood fired, and it's charred. These bakers are loving to just get a really nice color on that bread, so it's kind of on the edge of being burnt, but it's not. I'll also be talking tonight about this phenomenon that's happening. It's these little regional grain-based economies that are coming back into our cities and our towns. And it involves a really interesting mix of players, and that's the farmers, the breeders, the wheat breeder, the miller, and the baker. And then I'll walk you through the science of baking and the steps it takes to bake whole grain breads that may have some little different little nuances that regular baking with white flour doesn't have. This is a baker in San Francisco that I took one of my first whole grain baking classes, and he is he's a master at using this whole grain technique that tends to be you put a lot of water. It can hold a lot more water than white flour can, and so you're starting to work with doughs that are really kind of loosey-goosey, and it takes a lot of really interesting approaches to deal with that. So here I am at my wood-fired oven in my backyard, I want to just give you kind of a little background, my story. I started off in science at Utah State. I got a biology degree, an undergraduate biology degree. But I realized pretty quickly that maybe wasn't my forte. And so I decided to go to cooking school. I had always really enjoyed cooking and watching my mother cook at home. So I enrolled in an apprenticeship program out of Salt Lake City. It was a 3-year program, and did that and learned a lot about cooking. And as I told you, 3/4 of the way through having my restaurant, I decided to maybe switch gears. When I had been going to school, I had been dating this woman that is now my wife, Diane, and so she had a wonderful bookstore in town. I was in Park City at the time, so my choice was to come to Logan, and I was really happy to do that because I really enjoyed my school days in Logan. So how did I learn to bake? That's the question. I had known about this baking technique from reading that article, and I started to research a little bit, and I found out that on the West Coast there was quite a few French bakers that were mentoring young bakers through giving them classes, but also starting them out with their own bakeries and teaching them how to bake. And one in particular, man's named Michel Suez. He owns the San Francisco Baking Institute, and he is really the man who maybe 40 years ago started this first bread revolution. And he also started a European style bread guild of America, so where young bakers or people interested in baking could attend conferences or seminars and really learn some techniques on how to work with natural leavened or wild cultured breads. And then also I did a lot of research. I had two friends who became kind of partners in philosophy for opening the bakery, Josh Archibald and John Reichard, and I sent them out across the country learning how to bake at really nice artisan bakeries while I was in Logan designing, and we were building our bakery. And then really you just learn just from research and on the ground, boots on the ground type of things, just getting in there and making batches of dough and seeing what goes wrong and then changing it. So that's kind of how I got into baking. So now I think I'm going to pass out. I've got some samples of flour that I just milled with this little stone mill. And I'd like you to just go ahead and just put your hand inside there and feel it, and maybe even give it a smell and see the texture of what flour looks like when it's stone ground. You can notice that it'll have a really nice golden color, and it should have kind of a nice aroma. Also going to be passing out these little jars that have a starter that I have my wild culture made from. And look at it closely. You can see all these little yeast growth, these little cells, these little bubbles. And that's kind of how we start the wild culture from the get-go. And we'll go through that. Just take a look at it, just visually, don't open it up or we'll lose the starter all over. Okay, so what are the steps in making whole grain bread? I wanted to show you just so we can understand what whole grain baking is. This is a stalk of wheat, and each one of those little kernels there are a grain of wheat. When you pull those off and you take out the outer husk, then you have the grain, which is just an ideal storehouse of nutrients. But it can last a long time if you keep it dry. But as soon as you crack it or get it wet, it opens up, and as you can see here on this picture of this grain anatomy, you'll see what's inside. And right here you've got the germ, and the germ is where the embryo is. And so if that gets opened, you'll have a new plant starting to grow, and that germ is made up with a lot of oils and nutrients that'll start that new plant. The other part is the endosperm, and that's made up primarily of starches. It's like 70% starches. And when that is milled, when this grain is milled, the traditional way, they use roller mills where they'll roll the grain in between these rollers by vibration, and they'll progressively start taking off layers of the grain until you get down to the endosperm, and that's how they make white flour. So that's a many-step process to get to white flour. This outer layers, it's more than one layer of bran, but these outer layers have a lot of micronutrients and also fiber. So what whole grain baking is using that whole grain and millet to turn into flour versus taking just the endosperm and turning into white flour. So next we have ingredients. So it's always surprising to people to realize that it only takes flour, water, and salt to make good bread with a wild culture. So what a wild culture is, and I'll just back up here, is on the outside of that grain there are a host of yeast and bacteria that are in the air, they're on the grain, and when you mill that grain into flour, you have the makings for growing a culture of yeast with that flour. And all you need is water that's at a nice temperature, like maybe bath water, 100 degrees, and you need time for those yeast cells to start growing. And then you just keep on making a successive feeding of a new culture every day, and after about a week you have what you see in front of you is this culture of yeast that has thousands of yeast cells, and it's a very vibrant culture to then inoculate your dough. And that is what we're talking about when we say wild culture. So this mixing stage, here I am at home, and what I do is I just use this tub, and I've got on this formula that I'm using, I've just taken some cracked grain and I've soaked it for texture and flavor. And then this is my what bakers call the levain, and how that was made was that starter that's being passed around the night before. I've added just a little bit of that starter, just microdosing it. And the nice thing about whole grain flour is that it has so much yeast in it that you just need that little bit of microdosing. The percentage of flour that's in that starter is a percentage of flour that with water and the starter that is going to start breaking down the starches into simple sugars. So you're sort of pre-digesting that portion of the flour prior to mixing it. In this case, I also have 2 starters, so or 2 levains, or pre-ferments as they call them. A baker can use as many starters as they want, or different grains, as sort of their palette of flavor components for their bread. So I take all these ingredients and water, and I just start hand mixing it. Now, commercial bakeries have actual mixers, but these mixers were designed to simulate hand mixing, so very gentle mixing. But at home, you can do it yourself by hand, and it takes maybe about 20 minutes. And by 20 minutes, you've got a really beautiful, smooth dough. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to hydrate all the particles of flour with that water. So after you mix it, you let it sit for about 3 hours, and that's called the first fermentation. And when that fermentation is going on, what's happening with those yeast and bacteria is that you're getting all this alcoholic production, these gases, and you're getting production of organic acids that are producing these flavor components. And you can test that by just looking at the dough, and that dough has a more of a billowy characteristic to it. If you smelled it close, it would have a very fragrant flavor. And then what we've done here is we've cut it with a knife, and if you look at that slice, you can see that you've got all those little holes where the yeast are growing, and that's telling you that you've had a really good first fermentation. And I had a really good mentor, a French baker, who used to tell me, Bill, if you do anything, do not shorten your first fermentation, because that is what really shows the character of what your final dough will be. So after you mix it and you've got your first fermentation, then you're ready to dump that dough on a table. You've got a scale that you can weigh it with. You want to get every piece of dough the same. You want to be really gentle with the dough at this point, so you're laying it on the table, and you very carefully are forming it into whatever size of whatever type of bread you're making. And the other aspect that this fermentation is creating is you're creating strength for the dough. And if you can imagine, you've got these yeast cells in the dough, and it's like I'm the yeast cell, and I'm producing carbon dioxide, I'm releasing carbon dioxide, and I'm blowing up this big balloon in the dough. And if you don't have this thing called strength that's building from that wild culture, you would just expand and you'd blow it out, and you wouldn't have any support for that space for that cell structure to grow. You're also developing this characteristic called extensibility. So if you're going to be making like a baguette, you can pull it out to the length of a baguette, and you're also getting elasticity, so it can come back. And if you're making just like a loaf of bread called a boule, which is a ball, you can make it into a smaller shape. So you're getting those three characteristics: strength, elasticity, and extensibility. So after that, we're putting our dough into these baskets, much like those baskets I sent around, and what these bakers are using nowadays is instead of pans to put their bread in, they're using these wicker baskets. And they place the formed dough in these baskets, and it goes through a second fermentation. So the second fermentation can be anywhere from 3 to 12 hours. And what that's doing again is it's developing more flavor components and more strength for the dough. So I think what you're getting from me is that we've got a really long process here. It may be up to 20 hours from start to finish. And I bet you're thinking to yourself, now I used to watch my grandmother make bread, and she would just take this little packet of yeast and put it in, and maybe the whole process would be 4 to 5 hours. And so, why are you going through all these steps? Why don't you just use commercial yeast? Anybody have any ideas on why? Please. Exactly. What about you?
It's because commercially bought yeast isn't as good as homemade yeast.
That too, yes. Well, you're right. So, but what we're looking for is that time period, and that during that time period is when all those flavors are developing, and that strength of the dough is developing, and that's kind of the key. The other aspect, what I mentioned before, is because this working with whole grains can take up a lot of water, you have to have all these techniques, and you have to really get that strength to be able to hold that water into a shape that will not just kind of go all over the place. So after you put it through the second fermentation, it's time to bake it. This gentleman, Mike Zakowski, he's a master baker, Olympic team member, and he is a really skilled whole grain baker. So he is taking those doughs and he's putting them on that loader. He's getting ready to load it into that oven. That's a commercial oven, and it's called a deck oven, and it is each of those layers there is one oven, and it has a thick earthenware hearth that when it's heated up, it'll hold that heat for a really long time, so you can do successive bakes. You also have this style of oven. This is an oven that I had in my backyard. That's a wood-fired oven. This one was made with the outside of it for insulation made with mud. These are really fun projects for young scout groups or for anybody that wants to have one of these wood-fired ovens in their backyard. These things you can have finished in maybe a 2-day process. So you load the dough in, and one thing you have to do, because if you were to be loading some of this dough onto that loader, you would notice that the doughs have an incredibly amount of energy. It looks like kind of like another being from another planet. There's so much energy in it. And if you just put that in, you're going to find out that somewhere on that loaf didn't have a lot of strength. And so you'll get this big blowout. It'll look like Mount St. Helens exploding, and it'll be really ugly. So you take a razor blade and you make this scoring motion, and oftentimes you'll make a design on the outside of the bread. And you'll end up getting a real even rise, and you'll get this great, beautiful motif of a wheat stalk. And that's Mike with one of his whole grain breads that were just turned out really nicely. So that's the process. The second part is kind of like, what are the health benefits of whole grain baking? There's a gentleman in Oakland named Bob Klein that started this company, Community Grains. And he also, in 2014, started this whole grain conference. And a friend, Ron Munger, and I decided to go down and attend this whole grain conference. And it was a really interesting conference because it was basically made up with a panel of farmers, wheat breeders, millers, bakers, food scientists, plant geneticists, and some fairly famous food writers that have written a lot about baking. And it was a real interesting conference because the gist of it was that in addition to having a high fiber diet, which is really beneficial to us, as we know, is that when you mill flour with conventional commercial mills, you get all that long process to develop the white flour. And often these mills then will not just sell white flour, but they'll sell whole wheat flour, and they're essentially just putting back those components. Versus if you take a mill that's a stone mill and you grind it up all at one time and keep it whole, there's a huge difference between those two flours that have been, the parts have been put back together, and the flour that has the parts in it always. Very higher micronutrients on the stone ground flour than on the roller mill flour. This gentleman, Bob Klein, went on to produce these whole grain pastas that are wonderful pastas, and he kind of developed this idea of, it's called 23 points of identity. And on the marketing side of it, on the box, it'll tell you which farm this grain came from, what type of seed was used, kind of how they practiced the ecology of the soil, the milling process, and the flour that was put into it. And that has become a kind of almost a standard in many food industries, such as the seafood industry. People are really interested in knowing where their food's coming from. Okay, so we're talking about this whole grain economy, and that again is made up by the farmer, the breeder, the miller, and the baker. This is a miller, a farmer, his name's Fritz Durst, and he's from Capay, California, which is the Sacramento Valley, and he has been a leader in growing these heirloom grains that we might have heard about. There's a lot of them out there. There's emmer that you've got to smell and taste or touch. There's einkorn that we'll take a look at. There's all these kind of heirloom grains, but then there's also these grains that these breeders that have developed that are regionally specific for, say, Cache Valley or for upstate New York. And the farmers are playing a big part in it, because if they grow those grains versus the commodity grains, they're getting almost like 3 times as much of the price for the heirloom grains as the commodity grains, which have a really high fluctuation in the pricing. This is a picture of an einkorn stalk. This is one of the oldest grains that man has used, and it is a wonderful grain to work with. This is a picture of buckwheat. It's a wonderful flavor that is used as an addition to in a bread formula, maybe just 5% just for flavor. And then we've got This gentleman on the right, David Hull, he is our local USU wheat breeder. So the breeder's role in this association is that he is trying to conventionally breed grains that will grow well in an area. And it can be, you can breed a grain for different areas, and that's what I mean by regionally specific. But he's also trying to breed a grain that will, when it's milled into flour, will have really good baking qualities, which is really important. The miller comes into play, and we're lucky in Cache Valley to have one of the top mills on the West Coast. It's called Central Mill, and they have been in business since the 1860s. What makes them so special is that they've developed a really close association with farmers, so they can essentially ask the farmer to grow whatever product they want, whatever grain they want. And so Central Mill has a huge selection of products that a baker can use to select from. This is a picture of a commercial roller mill operation, and each one of those are the flour comes through and it gets sifted, so it can go to the next roller and continually get sifted to finer and finer flour. This is a picture of a stone mill. This is what Josie Baker had in his bakery, and it's from Austria, and it's a really nice mill for small operations. This is a mill that Diane and I visited in Pennsylvania. It was started in the 1750s, and it was run by water power on this stream, and it's a stone milling operation. These are the stones of the mill. They had the mill taken apart, the stones taken apart while we were there. And you can see those little grooves right in there. As the two stones are turning and the grain's going through it, the flour goes out through these grooves and it goes back into the stone, and it continually grinds that until it becomes really smooth. So stone milling goes really slow. There's not much friction, so you get really low heat buildup of the grains, and that is really important for keeping those micronutrients in also. The last person in this that makes up this Association for Grain-Based Economy is the baker. And the baker then takes this flour that's been developed by all the other groups of people involved, and he tries to make it into a good bread, and it doesn't always happen. Many things can affect the quality of that flour, including in the field. You know, maybe there was a late rain and the grain gets affected by that. So the baker is taking this information that he's learned, and he's got information from the miller, and he's figuring out how to make the best bread possible. So how else is this, what's affecting this bread revolution, this whole grain revolution? A lot of it's what's happening is there's a lot of experimentation going on. This gentleman, Craig Ponsford, he's a master baker in California. He had a bakery much kind of like Crumb Brothers for many years, and then he decided that he would just put that aside and start baking with whole grains. And his little bakery that's probably about the size of a, of a little barber shop, he calls this bakery his innovation center. And it's an innovation center in the sense that if you were a young baker and you wanted to try out what you've been learning and you want to kind of get a start, see if you may want to start a business, you can go there and use his bakery and just use your social media and say, maybe next week for 2 days I'm going to have these breads and these pastries, and people will line up outside of his bakery for long lines to get these breads and pastries. You also have these bakers that are working with whole grain pastries. This gentleman is in Washington, and there's another one named Jeffrey Yankelo who's been making 100% whole grain croissants. And that's a really hard thing to do because you're trying to get this cell structure just right in croissants, and it's pretty easy to do that with white flour, but with whole grains it's really a challenge. But they've accomplished that. They're getting this beautiful structure and really great flavored croissants. There's a place in Washington. There's a man named Stephen Jones. He's a plant geneticist, and he started this idea where on campus it's called the Bread Lab, and he had this thing called the Grain Gathering, and people would come for the weekend and they had classes in how to bake with whole grain products. It's now expanded so much that they're doing workshops with people that are brewers, brewing beer, or distillers that are using specific grains for their products. So it's a huge addition to this whole grain revolution. They also do research. They did research for the food chain Chipotle in California, and they developed a 100% whole grain tortilla for Chipotle's. So it's a really amazing program they have up there in Washington State. And then the other aspect that's made this grain revolution happen, this whole grain revolution happen, is the media attention that has been given to whole grain baking. This is some participants in this competition, this bread baking competition in Paris that's held every 3 years. It's called the Coupe du Monde. And 40 years ago, when these French bakers were teaching the young American bakers how to bake, they told them about this competition. They formed these teams, and they didn't tell them that it was, since it's held every 3 years, that the first 6 months is when they're selecting the team members, and the rest of the 3 years is they're actually practicing, and they're going around the country honing their skills so when they compete against these famous bread baking countries, they could do well. The 3 categories that they have in this competition are bread baking, pastry making, and sculpturing contest. And in 1996, the American team went over to Paris and they won the gold medal. And it kind of blew everybody away from these countries like France and Germany and Italy that really know how to bake. They were wondering, how did the Americans learn how to bake so well? And so the media took this and really spread it in the United States, and it has really brought the attention from the public into what whole grain baking is, and it's really helped out the bakeries that have been around and that are just starting into have public acceptance of whole grain baking. Another picture of the Olympic team. And then this is a picture of Craig in his Ponsford's place with his chef's coat signed by all his friends. So, kind of in closing, I wanted to talk about kind of when I go out there and I talk to people about artisan baking and artisan cooking and talking about food, and what happens is that we start having this really interesting conversation, and people are telling their stories about either they're baking bread at home and they're really interested in it and they get really excited about that, or people that have traveled to bakeries in different parts of the country and they've learned the story of those bakeries and have really enjoyed that. And what they're doing is they're really just sharing their culture, and that, I think that's community building in many ways. It becomes kind of a glue that's a bond that forms between people that may think that they have a lot of differences between them, but when you start telling each other those stories, you realize there's a lot more, that you're a lot more alike than you are not alike. And I think it makes us think about Cache Valley, which is a grain-based economy, and realize how lucky we are that we're in this rural environment that has one of those attributes that we're looking for, but it also allows us to go out there and travel and visit these other bakeries. And so I would, in closing, I would say that you should, when you're out traveling, you should seek out these artisan bakers. And I think you'll find that there's a really neat connection for you and those people, and you'll find a lot of joy from learning those stories from those people. So thanks for coming tonight, and we'll do a little 10-minute question and answer period after this, but I really appreciate you coming.
Okay, well, it's a chance to ask Bill Oblock your questions about baking. We're going to ask him to repeat your question so that the rest of the audience can hear it.
Yes.
I have a question. How old does your mother start? Like, how long have you been doing that? Do you restart that often, or do you just keep using the same one over and over again, keep feeding it? What do you do?
Okay, so the question is my starter really old, or do I just keep on feeding it? And anything can happen, but generally if you make a starter and you put it in your fridge because you're not using it daily, then you're not feeding it. And if you let it go too long in your fridge, you start to lose the quality of that starter. So commercial bakeries, every day, they're actually probably feeding 2 to 3 times a day. So they're just always keeping that starter really strong. At home, if you are taking it out every week or so, or maybe even every 2 weeks, then you would just start off with maybe a little higher percentage of that starter with the ratio of flour and water for the first mix overnight. And then when it'll start growing, it'll probably be a little slower. And then on that second mix, so there's successive mixes, and you're always taking just a little bit out of that starter to make the next batch. And so after the second or third day, you usually have a very strong starter. So, but if I've forgotten my starter for a month or so, I'll oftentimes just start anew. And it takes about a week to get a really good starter going just from flour and water and the right temperature. Yes?
Okay, I'm back to the beginning of the starter because it was a little hard to hear you talk.
Oh, okay.
You grind your wheat.
Yes?
And then you add the water to that.
To make the starter?
To make the starter.
Yes.
Don't add anything else, it's just a little bit of water to the wheat.
Yeah, and you usually start with, especially if you're starting with a whole grain flour, has so many more enzymes and yeast cells in it than if you used white flour. So you always want to start, if you're starting from scratch, you always want to start with like a 100% whole wheat or a mixture of whole wheat and maybe rye, which has a lot of...
Because we grind our own wheat, so we just grind it, put a little water in it.
Yeah, I would put equal amounts of water with the flour and make that water really warm, like 100 degrees. Keep it about 80 degrees in the ambient temperature if you can. Let it go 24 hours. And then after 24 hours, you see a little bit of growth happening. And then you take a little bit of that, like maybe 20% of the amount of flour you're going to put in the next mix. Put that little, it's often called a mother. So you're putting that little seed, mother seed in there with the flour and the same amount of water, same temperature, and another 16 hours. So you're starting to cut down the hours. So 16 hours later, you got a lot more growth. You do that again, 8 hours later, and do that for 5 days.
Okay, both you guys can remember all this.
You can look it up online. You can find it. It's a pretty standard approach to making your own starter. So it's really easy if you've got 5 days and you've got time to do that. Yes. Chlorine in the water, yes. A lot of bakers will say, he's asking about should you worry about chlorine in your water when you're making your starter and your dough. And a lot of bakers will say to use distilled water, but in Cache Valley, the Crum Brothers, when I had Crum Brothers, I saw no problem with the chlorine content in the water. I had really strong starters, really strong doughs. So I don't think that's, personally, I don't think that's really a problem.
Excuse me, another thing on the water, does it matter whether you have soft water or hard water, or do you want to use the hard water?
I don't think it really matters. I really don't. Oh, repeat that. Okay. Okay, sorry. So she asked about hard versus soft water. Does that play a role? And I don't think it does myself. Yeah.
Well, if you're using natural starters and you're in different places, there's potentially going to be different yeasts. So how does that influence the starter? I mean, is that why maybe bread isn't exactly the same in different places because the starter that you would have is made up of local yeasts?
Yes.
So does the baker, with their culture, influence? Some people are really successful at bread making. Can there be your own culture on your hands?
Yeah.
Contribute at all to?
Okay. Okay. So the question is, if you're making a starter from different areas, are they different? Everybody's heard the story about maybe having a relative that was a gold miner in San Francisco, and they have their starter now in Utah, and it's really special, and all those kind of stories. And so, unfortunately, the science part of it is that you don't have a different starter. Once you take that starter that was from your grandmother, and you take that seed and you put new flour and water in it, after a couple days, it's not going to be the same, because every environment has kind of a predominant yeast, and it's usually the same species of yeast that's all over.
But if you're in France, for example, and you have bakers there, and you go to a bakery there, and you have bread there, can it differ from a bakery in San Francisco because they are different places? Not that you take the starter someplace else, but can the bread itself be different in those different places because they are different environments, and so the cultures?
Yes. Okay. So the question again is the bread different in different cities, different countries? because of the wild culture. And I still say that no, it's not different from the culture. It's probably mainly coming from the flowers, what types of flour they're putting together, the procedure, how they're making it. Generally more of that. And if they're using a long fermentation, it's generally that, not the starter. Yeah.
How does elevation affect the bread that you choose to make, or how you decide to go through the process of making bread?
Yeah. So does elevation affect how your bread rises and the process, how well it works? And I don't think that's a factor at all. I mean, I think at home as well as in a bakery, if you know the process, you just react to whatever's happening with your dough, and it's usually more of a temperature issue. So temperature is really big. So if you got too cold of a temperature, you have kind of sluggish growth. If you have too hot, it's too fast. So it's temperature, but then there's so many other aspects of this bread process. We talked about, so you've got the starter, and then you've got the levain or pre-ferment, whatever you want to call it. And the amount of the percentage of that you're putting in your bread formula, how many different preferments you're adding, those are the things that really make a difference in the dough performance. Yes?
Okay, so just a question I have. When you're making, I guess, a quality loaf of bread, is it okay to use more than one type of flour?
Great question. So if you're making a quality loaf of bread, if you want to make a quality loaf of bread, right? That's the question. Does it matter how many different types of flour you add to it? It does. It makes it more complex. And so bakers in general will use more than one flour. They'll use, it may be different types of flour, like maybe some rye and some wheat. They may add the buckwheat for flavor. There's a flour out there that's been being used a lot that's made from grape seeds, ground up grape seeds. It's produced in California, and you get a really interesting flavor from that if you just put a small amount in it, but you're also getting a high percentage of micronutrients in some of these things like grapeseed flour. So more of a nutrition aspect. But yes, you do. The more kind of combinations you put together, the more interesting that bread will be. Wow, right up there.
Our last question of the night.
How many bakeries have I been to? You should ask my wife that. Wherever we travel, I'm thinking about these bakeries that I've researched. So, I don't know, probably 100. More?
That was just last year.
Just last week.
Okay, I want to thank Bill again for coming to give us this great presentation.